In the rain-slicked shadows of 1998 London, the city's most dangerous man makes a choice that will set the streets on fire. Arthur Sterling, the cold-blooded king of the underground, spends £1 million at a secret auction, not for a territory but for a woman named Clara. He intended to buy a piece of property to humiliate his rivals, but by midnight the predator realizes he has found his only weakness. He outbid the world for her, but now he must burn his empire to the ground to keep her alive. One night, £1 million. One choice that proves even the most cruel heart has a price. The rain in London never felt like a cleansing force. It felt like a heavy grey blanket designed to drown the secrets of the city. On the night of November 14th, 1998, the air was thick with the scent of wet soot and expensive tobacco. Arthur Sterling sat in the back of his charcoal-coloured sedan, watching the droplets race down the glass like tears on a cold face. At 35 years old, Arthur was a man whose presence could silence a room before he even spoke. He had sharp, angular features, eyes the colour of flint, and a scar that ran like a jagged lightning bolt from his left temple to his jawline, a souvenir from a betrayal he had settled years ago. He was dressed in a bespoke wool coat that cost more than most men made in a year, his large, calloused hands resting motionless on his knees. Arthur wasn't a man of many words, but his mind was a constant engine of strategy and observation. He had climbed from the gutters of the East End to become the undisputed architect of London's shadow economy. He didn't consider himself a villain. He was simply a businessman who operated where the law was too afraid to tread. The car pulled up to a nondescript brick warehouse near the docks. The architecture was Victorian, imposing and decayed, a perfect shell for the filth that happened inside. Two men in dark suits stepped forward, their umbrellas shielding Arthur as he exited the vehicle. He didn't thank them. He simply walked, his boots clicking rhythmically against the cobblestones. Inside, the atmosphere shifted from the cold dampness of the street to a suffocating artificial warmth. The room was filled with men who held the world in their hands, politicians, shipping magnates and rival kings of the underground. They were gathered for a private liquidation, a polite term for an auction of things that shouldn't be for sale. Arthur took his seat in the front row. He wasn't there to buy, he was there to remind everyone who owned the territory. But then, the heavy velvet curtains on the small stage parted. Clara was led out by two handlers. She looked like a ghost trapped in a den of wolves. Her hair was the colour of spun honey, falling in messy waves over her shoulders, and her skin was pale, almost translucent under the harsh yellow lights. She wore a simple silk slip dress that clung to her frame, shivering not just from the chill, but from the raw predatory gazes of the men in the room. Her father, a man Arthur knew as a pathetic gambler with no spine, had finally run out of luck and used his only daughter as collateral for a debt that could never be paid. When Arthur looked at her, he expected to feel the usual cold indifference. Instead, something shifted. It was a visceral pull, a sudden tightening in his chest that he couldn't explain. She looked up, and for a split second, her blue eyes met his. There was no pleading in them, only a devastating, quiet dignity that seemed to challenge the very ground he sat on. The auctioneer started the bidding at £50,000. The voices rose quickly. 60, 80, 100,000. Julian Vane, a greasy opportunist with eyes like a snake, smirked as he raised his hand. 200,000, he called out, his voice oily and confident. Vane looked at Clara with a hunger that made Arthur's blood turn to ice. Arthur didn't raise his hand. He simply leaned forward, his voice cutting through the chatter like a blade. £500,000. The room went silent. The auctioneer hesitated, looking at Vane, then back to Arthur. 500,000. Going once. Going twice. 600, Vane barked, his face reddening. 1 million, Arthur said, not even looking at his rival. His gaze remained fixed on Clara. He watched the way her breath hitched, the way her collarbone jumped with every shallow lungful of air. Vane slumped back, defeated by a number he couldn't justify for a piece of property. The gavel fell. Arthur stood up as the crowd began to murmur. He walked onto the stage, his presence dwarfing the auctioneer. He approached Clara, and for the first time the scent of her reached him, a mix of vanilla and sheer terror. He reached out, his gloved hand tilting her chin up. Her skin was electric against the leather of his glove. "You're mine now," he whispered. His voice wasn't kind, but it lacked the cruelty she had expected. "Do you understand?" Clara didn't flinch. She simply nodded once, her eyes searching his for a sign of the monster everyone said he was. Arthur felt a surge of heat go through him, a physical reaction so intense it nearly broke his composure. He didn't see a slave or a debt. He saw a storm that he wasn't sure he could weather. He turned to his men. "Take her to the penthouse. Ensure she is fed and has whatever she needs. I will be there shortly." As he watched them lead her away, Arthur felt the eyes of the room on him. He had just spent a fortune on a woman he didn't need, making himself a target for every jealous soul in London. But as he walked back out into the rain, the cold water didn't feel so heavy anymore. The silence of the city was gone, replaced by the thundering beat of a heart he thought had stopped feeling years ago. The drive back was a blur of neon lights and grey stone. He thought about the way her hair looked under the lights, and the way her voice might sound if she ever decided to speak to him. He was a man of logic, of cold, hard facts, but as the elevator rose toward his sanctuary at the top of the city, he knew the rules had changed. The predator had brought something into his den that he didn't know how to kill, and as the doors slid open, the air in the hallway felt thinner, charged with a tension that promised a night unlike any other. The penthouse was a fortress of glass and steel, perched high above the city like a modern castle for a king who didn't want to be found. The elevator opened directly into the living area, a space dominated by dark marble, deep leather furniture, and a view of the skyline that felt almost suffocating in its vastness. Outside, the rain continued to lash against the floor-to-ceiling windows, creating a distorted, shimmering veil over the millions of lights below. Arthur entered the room long after his men had dropped Clara off. He had spent the intervening time in the lobby of his building, finishing a cigarette and making 3 phone calls that ensured Julian Vane would have a very difficult morning. When he finally stepped into his home, the silence was heavy, broken only by the low hum of the climate control system and the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. He found her standing by the window. She hadn't changed out of the silk slip dress, though someone had left a thick cashmere robe on the back of a chair for her. She stood perfectly still, her forehead pressed against the cold glass, looking out at the city as if searching for a way home that she knew didn't exist. Arthur shed his wool coat, tossing it onto a chair. He watched her for a long moment, the flickering light of the city casting shadows across the delicate curve of her back. She looked fragile, like a piece of fine porcelain that had been dropped and glued back together too many times. But when she turned to face him, the fire in her eyes told a different story. "You've been staring at me for 3 minutes," Clara said. Her voice was low and melodic, but it held a sharp edge of defiance. "Is that what £1 million buys you? The right to watch a woman drown in your living room?" Arthur felt a ghost of a smile tug at the corner of his mouth, the first time he had felt the urge to smile in months. He walked toward her, his footsteps muffled by the thick rug. £1 million buys me the right to do whatever I please within these walls," he said, stopping just inches from her. "But I find that staring is usually more revealing than talking." The air between them grew thick, charged with an energy that made the hair on Arthur's arm stand up. He could smell the vanilla again, now mixed with the scent of expensive rain-scented soap. Up close, Clara was even more striking. Her skin was flushed, and her chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths. "I'm not a piece of property, Arthur Sterling," she whispered, her gaze never wavering. "My father might have signed a paper, but my soul wasn't part of the contract." "I don't care about souls," Arthur replied. He reached out, his bare hand tracing the line of her shoulder. His touch was slow, deliberate. "I care about loyalty. I care about the fact that you belong here, because there is nowhere else for you to go. Your father is halfway to the coast by now with enough money to stay drunk for a year. He didn't look back once." He saw the pain flash in her eyes, a momentary fracture in her armor. She winced, and for a second she leaned into his touch, a reflexive seeking of warmth in a cold world. Arthur felt the heat of her skin under his fingers, a searing contrast to the chill of the glass behind her. He moved his hand up, his thumb brushing against the pulse point in her neck. It was racing, a frantic little bird trapped beneath silk and bone. "Why me?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Vane would have paid half that. You could have had anyone. Why did you empty your pockets for a stranger?" Arthur leaned down, his face so close to hers that he could feel her warm breath on his lips. The sensuality of the moment was overwhelming, a magnetic pull that threatened to snap his self-control. He wasn't a man who indulged in lust. He viewed it as a weakness, a distraction from the business of power. But with Clara it felt different. It felt like a necessity. "Because you didn't look at me like the others did," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "They looked at me and saw a man to be feared, or a man to be used. You looked at me as if you were waiting for me to fail." He moved his hand to the small of her back, pulling her toward him. The silk of her dress slid against his palms, a smooth, liquid sensation. Clara gasped, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. She didn't push him away. Instead, her fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt, anchoring herself. The contact was electric, a slow-burning fuse that sent heat through Arthur's veins. "And are you?" she asked, her blue eyes searching his flint-grey ones. "Are you going to fail, Arthur?" He didn't answer with words. He moved his other hand to her waist, his fingers splaying across her hip. The physical closeness was an intrusion, a violation of the boundaries he usually kept so rigidly in place. He could feel the curve of her body, the softness of her against his hardness. It was a dance of power and surrender, played out in the shadows of a room with no windows to the past. "I don't fail," he finally said, his voice vibrating against her skin. "I only decide when the game is over." He let his hand slide down her arm, his fingers interlacing with hers. Her hand was small and cold, but she squeezed back with a strength that surprised him. In that moment, the predator and the prey seemed to blur into something else, two lonely ghosts haunting a palace of glass. "You're shaking," Arthur noted, his gaze falling to her lips. "It's not from the cold," she replied, her honesty cutting through his defenses like a knife. The tension reached a breaking point. Arthur felt a surge of something that wasn't just desire. It was a desperate, aching curiosity. He wanted to know the woman behind the defiance. He wanted to know if her heart beat as fast as his was starting to. He leaned in further, his lips brushing against her ear, his scent, sandalwood and rain, filling her senses. "There's a room prepared for you," he whispered, "with a bed that doesn't feel like a cage. You can stay there, or you can stay here with me. The choice is yours, Clara. For the first time tonight, you get to choose." He pulled back just enough to look at her, waiting for the rejection he expected. But Clara didn't move. She stayed in the circle of his arms, her eyes wide and dark, with a realization that mirrored his own. The night was far from over, and as the clock in the hallway struck the next mark, the silence of the penthouse began to feel less like a fortress and more like a bridge between two worlds that were never supposed to meet. Arthur felt the weight of the moment, the way his own history seemed to press against his chest, begging to be shared. He looked at the woman he had bought, and for the first time in his life, he wondered if the real price of the auction was a debt he would be paying for the rest of his life. The clock in the hallway chimed 3 times, the sound echoing through the cavernous penthouse like a heartbeat in a tomb. The rain had settled into a steady, rhythmic drumming against the glass, a sound that usually lulled Arthur into a state of cold, calculated alertness. But tonight, with Clara standing within the circle of his arms, the sound felt different. It felt like a countdown. Arthur stepped back, the loss of her physical warmth hitting him with a sudden, sharp clarity. He turned toward a side table made of dark, polished mahogany and poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a crystal glass. The whiskey caught the dim light, glowing like a liquid sun. He didn't offer her a drink. He knew she wouldn't take it. "Sit," he said, gesturing toward the oversized leather sofa that faced the skyline. His voice was less of a command and more of an invitation, though the habit of authority was hard to break. Clara hesitated, then moved with a grace that seemed at odds with the trauma of the evening. She sat on the very edge of the cushion, her hands folded in her lap, looking like a bird ready to take flight at the first sign of a closing door. Arthur didn't sit next to her. Instead, he leaned against the cold marble of the fireplace mantel, watching her through the haze of his own exhaustion. You speak as if you've lived 1,000 lives, Clara, Arthur said, taking a slow sip of the whiskey. The burn in his throat was familiar and grounding. Most women in your position would be screaming or pleading or trying to find the nearest exit. I've spent my life watching my father lose everything one card at a time, she replied, her eyes fixed on the rain-streaked window. You learn quickly that screaming doesn't change the hand you're dealt. You just have to decide how to play the remaining cards. Arthur looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in 10 years, he felt the heavy iron gates around his heart groan. He saw the bruises on her soul, the same kind he carried beneath his expensive suits and the scars on his face. I grew up in a room smaller than your walk-in closet, Arthur began, his voice dropping to a low, reflective tone. He hadn't spoken about his childhood to anyone in over a decade. The words felt heavy and strange in his mouth. In the East End, near the old tanneries, the smell of rot and chemicals was so thick you could taste it in your sleep. My mother worked 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. And my father, well, he was a man who found his courage at the bottom of a bottle of cheap gin. Clara turned her head, her gaze softening as she listened to the butcher of London unravel a piece of himself. One night when I was only 12 years old, Arthur continued, his fingers tightening around the glass, he came home in a rage. He had lost his week's wages at the dog tracks. He started on my mother. I tried to stop him with a kitchen knife. He gave me this. He gestured to the jagged scar on his temple. I didn't cry. I just waited until he fell into a drunken stupor, and then I took the only thing he valued, his gold watch, and I walked out into the rain. I never went back. The silence that followed was thick with the weight of shared misery. Clara rose from the sofa, her movements slow and deliberate. She walked toward him, stopping just a foot away. The sensuality of her presence was like a physical weight, a magnetic pull that Arthur found impossible to resist. "And you've been running ever since," she whispered. She reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from the scar on his face. "Building a world of glass and steel so no one can ever get close enough to hurt you again." Arthur didn't pull away. He leaned into her hand, the touch of her bare skin against his scarred flesh, sending a jolt of pure, unadulterated heat through his body. Her fingers were soft, tracing the rough texture of the wound with a tenderness that made his breath catch. The contact was intimate, a silent communication of pain and recognition. "I don't run," Arthur growled, though there was no bite in it. He reached up, his large hand covering hers, pressing it more firmly against his cheek. Her skin felt like silk, the warmth of it seeping into his bones. "I conquer. I make sure that I am the one holding the knife." "But who holds you, Arthur?" Clara asked, her blue eyes searching his. He moved his hand from her face to her waist, pulling her flush against him. The contact was electric. He could feel the curve of her hips, the softness of her breasts against his chest, and the frantic, rhythmic thrumming of her heart. The scent of vanilla and rain was overwhelming, a drug that clouded his logic. He leaned down, his lips brushing against her forehead, then her temple, lingering near the sensitive skin of her ear. "Tonight," he whispered, his voice vibrating against her skin. "No one holds anyone. We are just 2 ghosts trying to find a reason to stay in the world of the living." His hand slid down to the small of her back, his fingers tracing the delicate line of her spine through the thin silk of her dress. Every touch was heavy with meaning, a slow-burning fire that threatened to consume the walls he had spent a lifetime building. Clara sighed, a soft, broken sound that she muffled against his shoulder. Her hands came up to wrap around his neck, her fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck. In that moment, Arthur Sterling, the man who had killed rivals without blinking, the man who owned half the docks in the city, felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt since he was a boy in the East End. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't just lust. It was empathy. It was the terrifying realization that this woman, bought at an auction for £1 million, might be the only person in London who truly saw him. As the night deepened, the intimacy between them grew, a quiet storm brewing within the penthouse. They stood there for a long time, held together by a shared history of shadows. But even as Arthur allowed himself to feel the warmth of her body, his mind couldn't entirely quiet the instinct of the predator. He knew that Julian Vane wouldn't take the loss at the auction lightly. In the world Arthur built, a display of emotion was a display of weakness, and he had just shown the entire underworld that he was willing to pay any price for a girl with honey-colored hair. As he held Clara tighter, watching the grey dawn begin to bleed through the rain, he knew that the peace of the penthouse was an illusion. The serpent was already waking up, and the game was about to become much more dangerous than a simple bid for a debt. The morning of November 15th, 1998, arrived not with a sunrise, but with a thickening of the London fog that swallowed the tops of the skyscrapers. Inside the penthouse, the grey light filtered through the condensation on the windows, casting long, muted shadows across the bedroom. Arthur had not slept. He had spent the remaining hours of the dark watching the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of Clara's shoulders as she finally succumbed to exhaustion. She was tangled in the heavy silk sheets, her hair a golden halo against the charcoal pillowcase. Even in sleep, there was a faint line of tension between her brows. Arthur sat in a chair by the foot of the bed, his shirt unbuttoned, his gaze fixed on her. He felt a strange heavy weight in his chest, a feeling of possession that was rapidly morphing into something far more dangerous, a need to protect. When Clara finally stirred, her eyes snapped open, filled with a momentary panic before they landed on him. She didn't pull the covers up to hide herself. She simply sat up, the silk sliding down to reveal the delicate curve of her collarbone. The morning air was cool, but the space between them remained charged with the embers of the previous night's intimacy. "You're still here," she whispered, her voice raspy from sleep. "It's my house, Clara," Arthur replied, though his voice lacked its usual iron. He rose and walked toward the bed. The movement was predatory but slow, giving her every chance to look away. He sat on the edge of the mattress, the weight of him causing her to slide slightly toward him. He reached out, his hand sliding behind her neck, his thumb tracing the sensitive skin behind her ear. The contact was electric, a slow burning heat that radiated through his palm. Clara leaned into him, her forehead resting against his shoulder. The scent of her, vanilla and the lingering warmth of sleep, was an intoxicating distraction. "The world doesn't stop because we found a moment of peace," Arthur said, his voice vibrating against her temple. "My men are already reporting movement in the East End. Vane is talking. He's telling anyone who will listen that I've gone soft for a debt collection." Clara pulled back just enough to look him in the eye. Her hand came up to rest on his chest, her fingers splaying over the steady thrum of his heart. "Are you? Soft?" Arthur's jaw tightened. He leaned in, his lips inches from hers, the physical proximity a silent challenge. "I am many things, Clara. Soft is not one of them. But for the first time in 20 years I have something that isn't made of stone or steel, and that makes me a target." He stood up, the spell breaking as his phone began to vibrate on the nightstand. He moved to answer it, his demeanor shifting instantly back into the cold, calculated commander of the London streets. It was Marcus, his most trusted lieutenant. "Boss," Marcus's voice was tight. "There's a package downstairs, delivered by hand. No return address, but the courier was wearing a green tie. Vane's color." "Bring it up," Arthur ordered, his eyes flickering toward Clara. 10 minutes later, a small velvet-lined box sat on the kitchen island. Clara stood at a distance, watching as Arthur opened it with a pocket knife. Inside was not a bomb or a threat written in ink. It was something far more personal, a silver locket, tarnished and old. Arthur felt the air leave his lungs. He recognized it instantly. It belonged to Clara's mother, the one piece of jewelry her father hadn't managed to gamble away, the one item she had told him was stolen months ago. Beside the locket was a single handwritten note on heavy cream cardstock. £1 million is a high price for a bird in a cage. Let's see if she still sings when the cage starts to burn. Arthur crushed the note in his fist. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Vane didn't just know who she was. He had been inside her life long before the auction. He had been waiting for Arthur to make a move, waiting for him to show a vulnerability. Clara walked toward the island, her face pale as she saw the locket. She reached out to touch it, her fingers trembling. How did he get this? This was in my father's flat. hidden under the floorboards. Vane is a scavenger, Arthur growled, his voice thick with a simmering rage. He doesn't just want you, Clara. He wants to see me lose. He knows that by taking you, or even threatening you, he can dismantle everything I've built. He's been watching us, every touch, every word. He's been counting the seconds until I let my guard down. He turned to her, his hands gripping her shoulders. His touch was firm, almost bruising in its intensity. The sensuality of the morning was gone, replaced by a raw, jagged desperation. He pulled her flush against him, his face buried in the crook of her neck. He could feel her heart racing against his own, a frantic, mirrored rhythm. "You aren't leaving this building," Arthur whispered, his breath hot against her skin. "I will double the guards. I will turn this place into a tomb if I have to. Do you understand me? You are not a debt anymore. You are the only thing in this city that matters." Clara wrapped her arms around his waist, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had turned to liquid. "He won't stop, Arthur. Men like Julian Vane, they don't care about the money, they care about the blood." "Then I will give him blood," Arthur promised. He pulled back, his eyes flashing with a cold, murderous light. He looked at the locket, then back at Clara. He reached out, his hand tracing the line of her jaw one last time before he turned toward the door. "But it won't be yours, and it won't be mine." As Arthur walked out of the penthouse to gather his lieutenants, the fog outside seemed to press even closer against the glass. The grey silence of the morning felt like a bated breath, the city itself waiting for the first shot to be fired. Vane had thrown the first stone, but he had no idea of the landslide he was about to trigger. Arthur Sterling was no longer just a gangster protecting his turf. He was a man protecting his soul, and in the dark alleys of London, that made him the most dangerous predator of all. Inside the penthouse, Clara picked up the silver locket, the cold metal biting into her palm. She looked at the door Arthur had just walked through, a feeling of impending doom settling in her gut. The game had shifted from a bid to a war, and she knew that before the week was out, the streets would run red with the cost of her freedom. The morning of November 16th, 1998, was swallowed by a fog so thick it felt as though the city of London had been erased from the map, leaving only the sound of distant foghorns and the rhythmic drip of moisture from iron railings. Arthur Sterling sat in his private office at the back of the Gilded Cage, a club that served as the heartbeat of his operations. The room was panelled in dark walnut, smelling of old money, expensive leather, and the lingering scent of the peppermint tea he drank to keep his mind sharp. On his desk lay a map of the East London docks. For 15 years, Arthur had plotted to own them. They were the ultimate prize, a gateway for every shipment, legal or otherwise, entering the heart of the country. Controlling them meant becoming untouchable. He had spent millions in bribes and spilled enough blood to fill a canal to get to this point. Now the final signatures were all that remained. A knock at the door broke his concentration. Marcus entered, looking more haggard than usual. He placed a burner phone on the mahogany surface. It was vibrating. "It is him," Marcus said, his voice a low rumble. "He says it is a one-time offer. No negotiations." Arthur picked up the phone. He didn't say hello, he waited. "Arthur," Julian Vane's voice crackled through the speaker, oily and thick with a triumphant edge. "I hope you are enjoying your £1 million investment. She is quite a beauty, isn't she? A bit high maintenance for a man of your practical nature, I imagine." "Get to the point, Julian," Arthur said, his voice as cold as the river outside. "The docks, Arthur. The signatures you need from the harbour board? I have them. I bought the chairman's gambling debts this morning. I own the gateway you have wanted your entire life, and I am prepared to hand them over to you. Every pier, every warehouse, every cent of profit for the next 20 years. Arthur's grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles turned white. "And the price?" "You know the price. Bring the girl to the pier at Greenwich, tonight, unharmed. We trade. You get the kingdom you've built your life for, and I get the girl who made you forget you were a king. It is a simple business transaction, Arthur. One you would have made 1,000 times before." Arthur hung up without a word. He stared at the map, the lines of the river looking like veins on a dying man's hand. He felt the weight of 15 years of ambition pressing against his ribs. This was everything he had ever wanted. It was the reason he had survived the tanneries, the reason he had taken the scar on his face. He left the club and drove back to the penthouse, the grey streets passing by in a blur of neon and shadow. When he entered, the silence was different. It wasn't the silence of a fortress. It was the silence of a home that was about to be broken. He found Clara in the library, a room filled with thousands of books she was slowly beginning to organize. She was wearing one of his white dress shirts, the sleeves rolled up, the fabric draping over her frame like a soft silk cloud. The sight of her, so domestic, so real, sent a jolt of agony through his chest. She looked up as he entered, and the smile that touched her lips was enough to make him want to burn the docks to the ground. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said softly, walking toward him. Arthur didn't speak. He reached out, his hands grasping her waist, pulling her flush against him. The contact was desperate, a raw seeking of solid ground. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the vanilla and the warmth of her skin. The sensuality of the moment was laced with a devastating grief. He could feel the curve of her hips, the softness of her breath against his ear, and the way her hands came up to stroke the back of his head. "He offered me the docks," Arthur whispered into her skin, his voice breaking in a way it never had before. Clara went still in his arms. She knew what those docks meant to him. He had told her stories of the ships and the power they represented. And what did he ask for in return? Arthur pulled back just enough to look into her blue eyes. His hands moved up to frame her face, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones with a tenderness that was almost painful. "He asked for the only thing I have that is worth more than the world." The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of the choice. Arthur's mind was a battlefield. He saw the docks, the power, the money. And then he saw Clara, the way she looked at him without fear, the way she had stitched together the broken pieces of his heart without even trying. "I have spent my life building walls, Clara," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, intense whisper. "I thought that if I owned enough of this city, I would finally be safe. I thought that power was the only thing that could keep the darkness away." He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers in a slow, lingering contact that was more of a vow than a kiss. The heat between them flared, a physical manifestation of the choice he was making. He could feel her heart thrumming against his chest, a frantic living thing that he was being asked to discard. "But if I trade you for those docks," he continued, his forehead resting against hers, "I will be standing on a kingdom of ash. I would own the city, but I would be the poorest man in it." He pulled her closer, his hands sliding down to the small of her back, pressing her into him as if he could merge their souls. The sensuality of their connection was at its peak, a desperate, clinging intimacy that defied the logic of the underworld. "I am not going to the pier, Clara," he whispered against her lips. "I am going to war." Clara's breath hitched and she pulled him into a deep, searching kiss. It was a kiss of gratitude, of fear, and of a love that had bloomed in the harshest of winters. In that moment, Arthur Sterling officially died as a businessman and was reborn as something far more dangerous. He walked to the window, looking out at the foggy expanse of the city he had just refused to own. He knew what would happen next. By refusing Vane's offer, he had insulted the most powerful men in London. He had shown his hand. He had shown his heart. "Marcus," Arthur said into his radio, his eyes fixed on the shadows below. "Gather everyone. The docks are gone. We are moving to the second phase. Tell the men to prepare for a siege, and Marcus, tell them that from this moment on, anyone who mentions the word profit will answer to me." As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a bloody orange glow over the Thames, the lines were drawn. Arthur had chosen the woman over the empire, a decision that would send shockwaves through the streets of London. The refusal was a declaration of war, and as the first lights of the evening flickered on, the predator prepared to defend his den against the entire world. The loop was closing, and the next time the phone rang, it wouldn't be a deal. It would be a death sentence. The night of November 17th, 1998, was colder than the ones before it, the kind of cold that seemed to seep through the stone walls of London and settle in the marrow of one's bones. Arthur Sterling stood in the centre of a dimly lit garage in Southwark, the smell of grease, old rubber, and spent gunpowder hanging heavy in the air. He was checking the weight of a 9mm pistol in his hand, his movements mechanical and precise. Around him, his men moved like shadows, but the atmosphere had changed. The easy camaraderie of a crew that knew they were on the winning side had been replaced by a jagged, suspicious silence. Arthur felt it in the way they avoided his eyes, the way their conversations died out when he walked past. He had walked away from the docks, the one thing they had all bled for, and the cost of that choice was beginning to weigh on the loyalty of men who traded only in silver and lead. "We move at midnight," Arthur said to Marcus, who was leaning against a black-armored SUV. Marcus didn't nod with his usual fervor. He looked at the floor, his jaw set. "The men are restless, Arthur. Liam and the boys from the East End. They're saying we're fighting a war for a ghost. They're saying Vane is offering a bounty on the girl that could buy 10 docks." Arthur stepped into Marcus's space, the air between them crackling. "I don't pay them to have opinions on ghosts. I pay them to pull triggers. If anyone has a problem with the direction of this firm, they can bring it to me directly." "They're afraid, Arthur," Marcus whispered, "and afraid men do desperate things." Arthur ignored the warning, his mind already drifting back to the penthouse where Clara was waiting under the watch of 4 guards. He hoped he could still trust. He left the garage, the engine of his car roaring to life, and drove back toward the city center. He needed to see her. He needed to feel the reality of his choice before the world fell apart. He found her in the master bedroom, the lights dimmed. She had fallen asleep in a chair by the window, a book open on her lap. The sight of her, so peaceful amidst the impending storm, sent a wave of possessive heat through his chest. He walked over and knelt beside her, his hand gently stroking her hair. Clara opened her eyes, and for a moment the fear was gone, replaced by a deep, drowsy warmth. She reached out, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, the rough stubble of his beard. The sensuality of the moment was thick, a quiet, intimate bubble in a world that was screaming for blood. "You're back," she murmured, her voice like velvet. "I'm here," he said, leaning in. He kissed her, a slow, deep contact that tasted of rain and desperation. He could feel the curve of her neck, the heat of her skin, and the way her body relaxed into his touch. For a split second, the docks, Julian Vane, and the betrayal of his men didn't exist. There was only the scent of her vanilla skin and the rhythmic thrum of their shared pulse. The moment was shattered by the sound of a heavy thud from the hallway, followed by the sharp, rhythmic crack of a suppressed firearm. Arthur was on his feet in a heartbeat, pulling Clara down toward the floor. "Stay low," he hissed, his gun already in his hand. The bedroom door was kicked open, and 2 men in black tactical gear burst in. They weren't Vane's men, they were wearing the insignia of Arthur's own security detail. It was Liam, the young lieutenant Marcus had warned him about. "Sorry, boss," Liam said, his voice shaking but his aim steady. "Vane's offering more than you ever did. It's just business." Arthur didn't hesitate. He fired twice. One bullet caught Liam in the chest, the other in the throat. The second man fired back, the round grazing Arthur's side. Arthur felt the white-hot sear of the bullet as it tore through his expensive wool coat and into his flesh. He grunted, firing again, dropping the second traitor where he stood. The penthouse was no longer a sanctuary, it was a kill zone. More boots echoed in the hallway. "We have to go, now." Arthur grabbed Clara's hand, pulling her toward the private elevator at the back of the suite. He was clutching his side, blood beginning to soak through his shirt and onto his fingers. They reached the elevator just as more men rounded the corner. The doors slid shut, and the car plummeted toward the underground garage. Arthur leaned against the wall, his face pale, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Arthur, you're bleeding!" Clara cried, her hands trembling as she reached for his wound. She pressed her palms against the tear in his side, her skin instantly stained with the dark, hot red of his life's blood. The physical contact was frantic and raw, a desperate attempt to keep him whole. "I'm fine," he lied, though the world was starting to tilt. The elevator doors opened into the garage. It was empty, save for his secondary car, a nondescript sedan hidden in a corner. They ran for it, the sound of their footsteps echoing like gunshots in the vast concrete space. Arthur slumped into the driver's seat, but his hands were shaking too hard to get the key into the ignition. He looked at Clara, and for the first time, he saw the opportunity for her to leave. The keys were in the console. The garage exit was open. He was wounded, perhaps dying, and she was free. "Take the car," Arthur gasped, his head falling back against the headrest. "Go. The gate is open. Vane wants me, not you. If you leave now, you can disappear." Clara looked at the open gate, then back at the man who had bought her, protected her, and was now bleeding out because he refused to give her up. She didn't move toward the driver's side. Instead, she climbed over the center console, pushing his hands away and taking the wheel herself. "I told you, Arthur Sterling," she said, her voice hard and steady despite the tears in her eyes. "My soul wasn't part of the contract. I'm not leaving you to die in a parking lot." She slammed the car into gear and roared out of the garage, the tires screaming against the concrete. As they hit the fog-drenched streets of London, the sound of sirens and pursuit followed close behind. Arthur felt his consciousness slipping, the warmth of Clara's hand on his thigh the only thing keeping him anchored to the world. They were two ghosts in a stolen car, fleeing a city that had turned into a furnace. The night was far from over, and as the shadow of the London Bridge loomed ahead of them in the mist, Arthur knew that the lion had fallen, but the hunt was only just beginning. The betrayal had cut deep, but as he looked at the woman driving him into the dark, he realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't fighting for a kingdom, he was fighting for a home. The safe house was a small, forgotten apartment above a defunct clockmaker's shop in a narrow alleyway. The air inside smelled of dust, dry wood, and the faint metallic tang of blood. Outside, the world was a grey void. The fog had become so dense that the streetlights were nothing more than ghostly yellow smudges in the dark. It was November 18th, 1998, a date that would forever be etched in the stone of Arthur's memory as the day he stopped being a businessman and became a soldier again. Arthur lay on a worn velvet sofa, his breath hitching as Clara worked. She had found a first aid kit in the kitchenette, and her hands, though trembling, were precise. She had cut away his blood-soaked shirt, exposing the jagged furrow where the bullet had kissed his ribs. The wound was shallow but angry, a crimson reminder of the price of his defiance. "Hold still," Clara whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the silence. She dipped a cloth into a bowl of warm water and pressed it against his side. Arthur groaned, his fingers digging into the upholstery. The pain was a sharp white light behind his eyes, but it was eclipsed by the sensation of her touch. Her fingers brushed against his bare skin, a searing contrast to the chill of the room. Despite the danger, the intimacy between them was overwhelming. As she leaned over him, her hair fell in a silken curtain, shielding them from the rest of the world. The scent of her, vanilla and the sharp tang of antiseptic, filled his senses, grounding him. "You're a good driver," Arthur managed to say, his voice a ragged rasp. Clara paused, her blue eyes meeting his. She reached up, her thumb tracing the line of his lower lip. The touch was slow, deliberate, and heavy with a sensuality that made his heart hammer against his ribs. "I had a good reason to keep the car on the road, Arthur." She leaned down, her lips brushing against his forehead, then his cheek, before lingering near his mouth. The physical pull was magnetic, a desperate need to affirm that they were still alive. Arthur reached up, his large hand cupping the back of her head, pulling her into a kiss that tasted of iron and salt. It was a vow, a silent promise that he would not let the night claim them. The heat between them flared, a fire in the middle of a frozen city, before he gently pushed her back. "I have to finish this," Arthur said, his eyes hardening into flint. "If I don't end Vane tonight, he will spend the rest of our lives hunting us. I won't let you live in the shadows of a man like that." He stood up, the movement sending a fresh wave of agony through his side, but he pushed it down into a dark corner of his mind. He found a clean black shirt in a drawer and pulled it on, the fabric rasping against his bandages. He checked his remaining weapon, the cold steel of the pistol feeling like an extension of his own hand. He didn't call Marcus. He didn't trust the phones anymore. Instead, he used the old ways, a series of coded knocks on a pipe that led to the floor below, where an old associate, a man who owed Arthur his life 10 times over, waited. The confrontation happened on the cobblestone yard of an abandoned textile mill. Julian Vane was there, surrounded by the remnants of Arthur's betrayed security detail. Vane looked out of place in the grime of the yard, his expensive silk tie fluttering in the damp breeze. He held a silver cane, tapping it rhythmically against the stone. "You're late, Arthur," Vane called out, his voice echoing off the brick walls. "I expected you to bleed out in that garage. It would have been cleaner for everyone." Arthur stepped out of the fog, a solitary figure against the gloom. He didn't look like a king. He looked like a reaper. "Business is never clean, Julian. You taught me that." The violence was swift and brutal. Arthur didn't fight like a man with something to lose. He fought like a man who had already found everything he needed. He used the fog as a shroud, moving through the shadows with a predatory grace that defied his injury. The traitors fell first, caught in the crossfire of their own greed. Finally, it was just Arthur and Vane. The snake was cornered, his bravado crumbling as he looked into Arthur's cold, grey eyes. Vane reached for a hidden holdout pistol, but Arthur was faster. One shot rang out, the sound swallowed by the heavy air. Julian Vane slumped against a stack of rotting crates, his silver cane clattering to the cobblestones. The Serpent of London looked small and pathetic in the mud, his life leaking out onto the stones he had tried to conquer. Arthur stood over him, the barrel of his gun still warm. He didn't feel the triumph he expected. He only felt a profound, heavy exhaustion. He looked at his hands. They were stained with the lifeblood of his enemies, but they were the same hands that had held Clara an hour ago. He turned away from the mill, walking back into the fog toward the safe house. The city felt different now. The weight of the docks, the empire, and the rivalries had been replaced by a singular, focused clarity. He had survived the auction, the betrayal, and the war. As he climbed the stairs back to the clockmaker's shop, his side was screaming, and his vision was blurring at the edges. He pushed open the door and saw Clara standing by the window, her silhouette framed by the pale light of the moon, struggling to break through the mist. She turned, and the look of pure, unadulterated relief on her face was worth more than every peer in the East End. He crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, his face buried in her hair. They stood there for a long time, the silence of the room a stark contrast to the echoes of the gunfire still ringing in his ears. The night was ending, and the blood on the cobblestones was already being washed away by the persistent London rain. But as Arthur held the woman he had bought for £1 million, he knew the real transition was just beginning. The king had burned his throne, and in its place, something far more permanent was taking root. The morning of January 5th, 1999, arrived with a rare, crisp clarity. The heavy grey fogs that had choked London during the final weeks of the previous year had finally dissipated, leaving behind a sky the colour of pale sapphires. The city below was beginning to stir, a tapestry of winter coats and steaming breath, but from the height of the penthouse, the world felt silent and serene. Arthur Sterling stood on the terrace, his hands resting on the cold iron railing. He was dressed in a simple black sweater and trousers, a stark departure from the armoured suits he used to wear like a second skin. The wound on his side had healed into a thick, silvery ridge, a permanent map of the night the world tried to break him. He didn't look like the butcher of London anymore. The hardness in his eyes hadn't disappeared, but it had been tempered, like steel that had been through the furnace and come out stronger, yet more refined. The aftermath of the battle at the textile mill had been swift and absolute. With Julian Vane dead and the traitors eliminated, the power vacuum in the city had been massive. Arthur had stepped back into the light, but he had done so on his own terms. He didn't reclaim the docks. He had let them fall to a consortium of smaller, less ambitious men who were content to bicker over the scraps. Arthur had kept his wealth, millions of pounds tucked away in accounts that the law couldn't touch, but he had shifted his focus. He was still a man of influence, but he no longer sought to own every brick in the city. He had found something worth more than a kingdom. The glass doors behind him slid open, and the scent of vanilla and fresh coffee drifted out onto the terrace. Arthur didn't need to turn to know it was Clara. He felt her presence like a physical warmth, a magnetic pull that had become the center of his universe. "The air is freezing out here," Clara said, her voice soft and vibrant. She walked toward him, wrapped in a thick cream-colored robe that contrasted beautifully with her honey-gold hair. She looked healthy, her skin glowing with a life that had been missing on the night of the auction. She stopped beside him, her shoulder brushing against his arm. Arthur turned, his hand reaching out to cup her face. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, a gesture that had become a silent language between them. The sensuality of the moment was profound, a deep-rooted intimacy that didn't need words. He leaned down, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was slow, deep, and filled with a quiet, fierce devotion. He could feel the curve of her body against his, the heat of her skin radiating through the layers of their clothing. Every touch was a reminder of the price they had paid and the victory they had won. "I was thinking about the auction," Arthur whispered, his voice vibrating against her lips. "About how I thought I was buying a solution to a problem. I thought I was just making a point to Vane." Clara smiled, her blue eyes searching his. She reached up, her fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck, pulling him closer. The physical closeness was electric, a slow-burning fire that never quite went out. "And what did you buy instead, Arthur?" "I bought a mirror," he replied, his gaze intense. "I bought the only thing in this city that could show me who I actually was. I spent 15 years building a fortress of glass, thinking I was protecting myself, but I was just building a cage. You didn't just save my life at the garage, Clara. You gave me a reason to have one." He pulled her into a tight embrace, his arms wrapping around her waist, pressing her flush against his chest. He could feel her heart beating in rhythm with his own, two lives that had been bought and sold, now inextricably linked by choice rather than contract. The sensuality of their bond was no longer a desperate seeking. It was a settled, powerful truth. He let his hand slide down the small of her back, the fabric of her robe sliding against his palm, a reminder of the softness he had finally allowed into his world. They spent the morning in the quiet sanctuary of the penthouse, watching the city below begin its daily grind. Arthur looked at the skyline, no longer seeing it as a territory to be conquered, but as a backdrop to the life he was finally living. He had lost the docks, he had lost the absolute fear of his enemies, and he had lost the cold, hollow emptiness that had once been his only companion. The lessons of the past few months were heavy, but they carried the weight of wisdom. Arthur knew that the world would always have men like Julian Vane, and the streets of London would always be paved with the consequences of greed. But he also knew that resilience wasn't just about surviving the storm. It was about the courage to rebuild when the sky cleared. He hadn't renounced his power or his wealth. He was still a formidable man, but he had redirected that force. He was a protector now, a guardian of the peace he had found in the blue eyes of the woman who should have been his victim. As the sun rose higher, casting a brilliant golden light over the Thames, Arthur felt a sense of completion. The cycle of violence that had defined his life since he was a 12-year-old boy in the East End had finally been broken. He had been a predator, a king and a ghost, but standing here with Clara, he was simply a man. "What happens now?" Clara asked, leaning her head against his shoulder. Arthur looked out over the city, a small, genuine smile touching his lips. "Whatever we want, Clara. For the first time in my life, the contract is empty. We get to write the rest of the story ourselves." The story of the Butcher of London ended that day, buried under the weight of a £1 million bid that had turned out to be the greatest bargain of his life. In its place was a new narrative, one of justice found in the shadows, of a love that bloomed in the coldest of soil, and of two souls who had learned that true power isn't found in what you own, but in who you are willing to bleed for. As the final echoes of the past faded into the winter air, Arthur and Clara turned back toward the warmth of their home, ready to face the new year not as master and prize, but as equals in a world that was finally beginning to make sense. The king had burned his throne, but he had found his queen, and in the heart of London, that was a victory that no auction could ever take away.